The morning after the worst storm of the winter, Elias Cole pressed his bare palm against the inner wall of the cave and did not pull it back. Outside, the thermometer nailed to a fence post read 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough that 3 ranches down the valley had already lost cattle overnight. Inside, the stone under his hand was not hot. It was not even warm enough to call comfortable, but it was warm enough that Scout, the dog curled against it, had not moved in 6 hours, and warm enough that Elias could still feel his own fingers. Nobody in the valley had believed this was possible. 6 months earlier, they had watched a former soldier buy the one piece of land nobody else wanted, a rocky ridge with deep crack in its face that the county assessor had labeled, without much thought, as unusable. They had watched him choose that crack over flat. Open meadow every other homesteader would have taken without hesitation. They had told him more than once that rock holds cold the way iron holds a grudge, and that he would freeze against that stone faster than he would freeze in open wind. What none of them had noticed, not in 20 years of grazing cattle past that ridge, was the way morning frost never quite settled on one narrow section of the rock face. What none of them had asked was why a strip of ground below that crack stayed dry when snow buried everything around it. Elias had asked, and the answer took him a failed attempt, a smoke-filled first week, and one very cold, very honest conversation with a rancher who thought he was about to attend a funeral. If you are listening from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are. Stories like this one survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if frontier ingenuity like this matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Elias Cole arrived in the valley in late summer, carrying 2 duffel bags, a canvas tent, and a discharge paper he did not show to anyone unless they asked twice. He was not old, not yet 35, but he moved like a man who had spent years listening for things other people did not hear. Back straight, steps measured, eyes always drifting toward the tree line, before settling on whoever was speaking to him. The war had taken something from him that the town could not quite name, but had also left it with a habit nobody in the valley shared. He noticed things. The land he bought was the cheapest available, a narrow strip of ridge above the main homesteads, marked on old county maps simply as a crack. A deep fissure ran through gray rock there, wide enough to walk into, deep enough that the previous owner had never bothered clearing it, and steep enough that most ranchers considered it dead ground, good for nothing but goats and bad luck. The land agent, a thin man named Foster, tried twice to steer him toward a flatter parcel near the creek. Good grass, Foster said. Level building ground. Neighbors close enough to help in a bad winter. Elias listened, nodded, and bought the ridge anyway, paying in full with money that had clearly been saved for exactly this kind of decision. Word moved through the valley within a week. A rancher named Walter Briggs, who had worked that land his whole life and buried 2 brothers in its winters, rode up to introduce himself and take a look at what the stranger intended to do with a hole in a rock. Walter was not a cruel man, and he was not looking to mock anyone. He had simply seen too many newcomers underestimate a Montana winter, and he had helped bury a few of them. Elias offered him coffee, and the 2 men sat at the mouth of the crevice while Walter explained, patiently and without malice, why building anywhere near that stone was a mistake. Rock does not forgive the way dirt does, Walter said. It holds the cold of the whole season and gives none of it back. You will freeze against that wall faster than you would freeze in a tent on open prairie. Elias listened to all of it. Then he asked a question that Walter had never considered in 30 years of grazing sheep past that same ridge. Why does the frost never sit heavy on that one stretch of rock, right there, even on the coldest mornings? Walter looked, really looked, for the first time in his life, and had no answer. By the second week of autumn, Elias had made a choice that would become the subject of dinner-table conversation across the entire valley for the rest of that year. Instead of building on the level ground Foster had recommended, or even on the safer slope just below the ridge. He began marking out the footprint of a small A-frame structure directly against the open mouth of the crevice, using the rock face itself as the back wall of his shelter. The design was simple on paper. Two steep, triangular walls of hewn timber meeting at a ridge beam, open at both ends, one end sealed against the stone, the other fitted with a low door framed in split pine. It was the kind of shape a man might choose to shed heavy snow quickly, and in that sense it made a certain rough sense. What made no sense to anyone watching was building it against rock that everyone agreed held the worst cold in the valley. Walter rode up twice more that month, each time trying a different argument. He pointed out that condensation would run down cold stone and soak every board Elias owned before first snowfall. He pointed out that smoke from any fire would have nowhere honest to go, trapped between wood and rock, and that men had suffocated in shelters built with less confidence than this one. He was not wrong to worry. He had seen it happen. Elias did not argue back with confidence. He did not have. He simply kept returning to the one detail that had caught his attention that first week, the dry, frost-free strip of stone that ran along the upper portion of the crevice, like a shelf no one had ever explained. He spent entire afternoons with his palm pressed to different sections of the rock, feeling for temperature that made no sense against everything Walter had told him. His neighbor, an elderly Norwegian immigrant named Ingrid Solberg, who had settled 2 valleys over as a young widow decades earlier, stopped by once with a jar of preserved plums and watched him work in silence for nearly an hour. She had grown up hearing stories, back in the old country, of families who built into hillsides rather than against open wind, though she admitted she had never seen it tried with a wooden frame quite like this one. It might work, she said finally, or it might not. But you are asking the right question, at least. The building itself took 11 days, most of them cold and gray, with a thin rain turned to sleet by the second week. Elias worked mostly alone, though Ingrid's grandson, a 14-year-old boy named Peter who had grown curious about the strange project on the ridge, began showing up most afternoons to help haul timber and hold beams steady while Elias notched and fitted them by hand. The timber came from a stand of lodgepole pine half a mile down the slope, cut, trimmed, and dragged up by horse and by hand. Each log had to be measured against the irregular stone face of the crevice, since no 2 sections of rock met the ground at quite the same angle. Elias spent almost 2 full days simply studying the shape of the opening before cutting a single beam, tracing the curve of the stone with his hands the way another man might read a letter. The A-frame rose slowly, its 2 angled walls leaning inward to meet at a ridge line roughly 12 feet above the cave floor. He sealed the gaps between timber and rock with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and ash, packed tight into every visible seam. Peter, more interested in the mechanics and the philosophy behind them, asked more than once why Elias did not simply build a normal cabin like everyone else. Elias's answers were usually short. Because a normal cabin fights the mountain, he said once. This one is supposed to lean on it. By the time the frame was closed in, with a low door of split pine fitted at the open end, the structure looked strange against the ridge, half building and half burrow, its back wall disappearing into darkness where the stone continued deeper than any lantern could show. Walter, riding past on his way to check fence lines, slowed his horse and stared at it for a long moment before continuing on without a word, which Ingrid later said was the closest thing to approval the old rancher was capable of showing a stranger. The first hard frost came 3 nights after the door was hung. Elias built a small fire near the mouth of the shelter, laid down a bedroll close enough to the stone to test its promise, and waited to see whether the coldest ground in the valley would keep the promise the frost pattern had seemed to make all autumn. The first week inside the shelter was worse than anything Elias had expected, and worse, if he was honest with himself, than the open prairie would have been. Moisture began forming on the inner stone within hours of the first fire, beating along the rock in fine droplets that ran down and pooled at the base of the wall, soaking into the dirt floor, and within 2 days, into the edge of his firewood stack. By the fourth night, the wood was too damp to catch properly. Smoke rolled up from the struggling fire in thick gray coils, and instead of rising and escaping through the gap he had left near the ridge beam, it curled back downward, pressed low by the cold stone above, filling the shelter until Elias's eyes burned and Scout began pawing at the door, whining low in his throat. Elias woke twice that week coughing, disoriented, forced to crawl to the door and lie flat against the frozen ground outside just to clear his lungs. It was, he later admitted to Ingrid, the closest he had come in that entire year to giving up and moving down the flat ground Foster had originally offered him. Walter heard about the smoke trouble from Peter, who mentioned it at supper without meaning to cause alarm. The old rancher rode up the following morning, not to gloat, but because he had seen smoke inhalation kill men before and did not intend to let happen a second time on his watch. He found Elias sitting outside the shelter in the cold, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the crevice with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem rather than admit defeat. "I told you rock does not forgive," Walter said, not unkindly. Elias did not disagree with him. Instead, he asked whether Walter had ever noticed which direction the wind moved when it reached the ridge, and whether it always came from the same side. Walter, somewhat surprised by the question, admitted he had never really watched for it. Not closely, not the way the strange young man apparently had been watching all autumn. Over the following days, Elias stopped building anything at all and started simply observing. He spent hours sitting at different points along the crevice, tracking where frost formed and where it did not, where snow drifted and where the ground beneath it stayed bare, and which direction the wind moved when it funneled to the narrow opening in the rock. What he found surprised him. The dry, frost-free shelf he had noticed back in autumn ran along a section of stone where the crevice curved slightly inward, deflecting wind rather than channeling it straight through. Deeper into the cave, past where his shelter's back wall now stood, the air felt noticeably warmer than the entrance, though nothing inside the rock could be generating the heat on its own. Ingrid, visiting again with Peter, mentioned something her late husband used to say about root cellars back in Norway, that the ground itself holds on to summer warmth far longer than anyone expects, releasing it slowly through the coldest months, provided the structure allows that warmth to move rather than trapping it uselessly against wet stone. It was not fire that kept the place livable in the deep cold, she said. It was patience and knowing where to let air go. Elias began to understand that his mistake had not been choosing the crevice. His mistake had been sealing it too completely, treating the stone like an enemy to be shut out rather than a slow, steady partner that needed room to breathe. The moisture collecting on the walls was not a flaw in the rock. It was trapped air with nowhere on it to travel, condensing against cold stone because its tightly sealed door and low ridge gap gave it no path outward. He also noticed, finally, that the deepest, driest part of the crevice sat slightly higher than the shelter's current floor, connected by a narrow channel that seemed, judging by old smoke stains barely visible on the upper stone, to have drawn air upward and outward long before he had ever arrived. Something at some point had used that channel before him. He never learned who. Elias rebuilt the entrance of the shelter over the following 10 days, this time working with the shape of the crevice rather than fighting it. He shifted the low door roughly 4 feet to the side, aligning it with the natural curve of the rock instead of the flattest available ground, and cut a second, smaller opening high near the back wall, where the old smoke stains suggested air had once moved freely. He packed the lower seams with fresh clay and dried moss, but left the upper channel deliberately open, covered only with a loose flap of hide that could be lifted or lowered depending on the wind. The fire pit itself he moved closer to the stone shelf that stayed warmest rather than the center of the floor, so that the rock could gather heat directly from the flame instead of receiving it secondhand through cold air. Walter came by twice during the rebuild, less skeptical now and more curious, asking questions instead of offering warnings. He watched Elias test a new upper vent by holding a thin strip of cloth near the opening and observing how steadily it pulled inward and upward, drawing stale air out through the channel instead of letting it settle back down into the shelter. The stone was never going to make heat on its own. Elias explained to Peter one afternoon, trying to put words to what he had only understood through weeks of watching and failing. It was only ever going to hold on to heat a little longer than open air would, provided the shelter gave the excess moisture and smoke somewhere honest to go instead of pressing it back down into the room. By the time the rebuild was finished, the shelter looked barely different from the outside. Still half timber and half stone, still strange against the ridge. But inside, the air moved differently. Smoke rose cleanly through the high vent instead of curling back down. The rock along the back wall, warmed steadily by a fire that finally had room to breathe, stayed noticeably warmer than the outside air for hours after flames had burned low. The first true test came in late November, when a 3-day storm rolled down from the north, dropping temperatures to roughly 10 degrees Fahrenheit and burying the valley under nearly 2 feet of snow. It was not the worst storm the region had seen, but it was enough to check whether Elias's corrections had actually solved anything, or whether he had simply traded one kind of failure for a slower one. For the first day and night, the shelter performed better than anything Elias had experienced there before. The high vent kept the air clear. The fire held steady against the warm stone, and Scout slept through night without the restless coughing fits that had marked the earlier failed attempt. Elias allowed himself, cautiously, to believe the correction had worked. On the second night, a weakness revealed itself near the newly positioned door, where wind-driven snow had begun working its way through a narrow gap along the frame that had not been a problem during calmer weather. By morning, a thin drift of snow had formed just inside the entrance, and the air near the floor at that end of the shelter felt noticeably colder than the air near the stone. It was a small failure compared to the smoke and soaked firewood of the first attempt, but Elias understood immediately that it mattered. Walter, arriving the following afternoon to check on him, noticed the same gap and pointed out, without any satisfaction in his voice, that a small weakness in calm weather could become a serious one in the kind of storm the valley sometimes saw in deep winter, when wind did not simply fall, but drove itself sideways into anything that gave an opening. Elias spent the following week reinforcing the door frame with a double layer of hide stretched over packed clay, angled slightly to shed wind rather than catch it directly. It was not a perfect solution, and he knew it, but it held through 2 more minor storms in December, each colder than the last, and by the time real winter settled fully over the ridge, the shelter had proven itself against everything except the one test that mattered most. In early January, word reached the valley of a storm system building far to the north, one that older residents were already comparing to the deep freeze of some years earlier, a stretch of cold so severe that livestock had died standing in their own barns, and at least one homestead further up the range had been abandoned entirely rather than risk another season like it. Walter rode up to the ridge personally to deliver the news, arriving with a seriousness that had replaced whatever skepticism remained from those early conversations back in autumn. Temperatures could fall as low as 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He told Elias, based on what the telegraph office in town had relayed from stations further north along the rail line. He offered, without hesitation, to let Elias and Scout stay in his own ranch house until the worst of it passed. It was a generous offer, and Elias understood exactly what it cost a proud, cautious man like Walter to make it. But he also understood, standing at the mouth of the crevice with his hand resting against stone that had, by that point, proven itself through 3 separate tests, that leaving now would mean never truly knowing whether the shelter could hold against the one storm severe enough to matter. Ingrid, when she heard the decision, did not try to talk him out of it, though she made him promise to keep the upper vent clear of ice and to check the door sealed daily rather than assume it would hold on its own. Peter, more excited than worried, asked if he could stay and watch, a request both Elias and his grandmother firmly refused. The storm arrived 2 days later, announced first by a strange stillness in the air, the kind old-timers in the valley claimed always preceded the worst weather, followed by a wall of cloud moving down from the mountains that blotted out the afternoon sun hours before the temperature began its real collapse toward record cold. The storm settled over the ridge just after dark, and for the first several hours, the shelter held exactly as it had during every previous test. The fire burned steady against the warm stone shelf. The high vent drew smoke and moisture cleanly upward, and Scout lay pressed against the rock wall in the same spot he always chose on the coldest nights. Sometime near midnight, the wind shifted direction, swinging from its usual northern approach to something closer to the northeast, striking the crevice at an angle Elias had never fully accounted for in any of his earlier observations. The reinforced door held, but the shift exposed a section of the upper vent's hide covering to a force of wind it had not been built to withstand. And within an hour, cold air began pressing steadily down into the shelter instead of drawing smoke cleanly out. Elias woke to the smell of smoke thickening near the ceiling and the sound of Scout's low, uneasy whine. He understood immediately that the wind had found the one angle his correction had not anticipated, and that he now had only minutes to decide whether to seal the vent entirely and risk trapping smoke again, or leave it open and risk losing the very draft that had kept the shelter livable through every storm before this one. He chose neither option fully. Instead, he packed a narrow wedge of clay against only the exposed upper edge of the vent, leaving the rest of the opening clear, betting that the stone stored warm from hours of steady fire would be enough to keep the draft moving even with the wind working against it. It was not a calculation made with confidence. It was a decision made with cold hands, in the dark, based on weeks of watching a mountain that had never fully explained itself. By early morning, the wind had settled back toward the north. The smoke had cleared, and the stone along the back wall, though not warm by any ordinary measure, remained noticeably warmer than the killing cold outside. When Walter rode up at first light, half expecting to find tragedy, he found Elias awake, exhausted and alive, with his palm pressed against rock that had, through the coldest night the valley had seen in years, kept its quiet promise. Walter did not apologize for his earlier warnings, and Elias did not expect him to. Instead, the old rancher simply asked, standing at the mouth of the crevice with his hat in his hands, whether Elias would be willing to explain, slowly and in detail, exactly how the vent and the stone and the angle of that door had come together to do what no one in the valley had believed possible. The shelter had never been about beating the mountain. It had been about learning, patiently and through failure, exactly what the mountain was already willing to give. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.